Hello everyone, and welcome to another Dark Ground video. In this video, we start off our Dark Ground serial killer series with the much anticipated killer couple, Fred and Rosemary West. So stay tuned. Hello everyone, and welcome back to another installment of the Dark Ground. In this video, as you heard from the intro, we'll be starting off our Dark Ground serial killer series. And what better way to start off this series than with a bang with the sinister couple Fred and Rosemary West that lived at 25 Cromwell Street here in the UK. Now, this is a case and a couple I know well about from many documentaries, myself being my forte. But let's start off this video going back in time. So, Frederick Walter Stephen West was born on the 29th of September 1941 at Bickerton Cottage, Much Marcle, Herefordshire. The first surviving child to Walter Stephen West and Daisy Hannah Hill. He was from a poor family of farm workers, close-knit and mutually protective. His father was a disciplinarian and his mother overprotective. In 1946, the family moved to Moorcourt Cottage at Moorcourt Farm, where Fred's father worked as a milking herdsman and harvest hand. The cottage had no electricity and was heated by a log fireplace. By 1951, Fred's mother had given birth to 8 children, 6 of whom survived, but Fred was always his mother's favourite. He was seen as a mother's boy and relied mostly on his siblings for companionship. The West children were expected to perform assigned chores, and all 6 did seasonal work. The 3 girls picking hops and strawberries, the 3 boys harvesting wheat and hunting rabbits. The necessity of working to earn a living or even just to survive instilled a strong work ethic in Fred, who also developed a lifelong habit of petty theft. Classmates recall Fred as scruffy, dim, lethargic and regularly in trouble. Throughout his life he remained scarcely literate, yet displayed an aptitude for woodwork and artwork. He left school in December of 1956 at age 15, initially working as a labourer at Moorcourt Farm. Fred claimed he was introduced to sex by his mother at 12, to have engaged in acts of bestiality with animals in his early teens, and his belief in incest being normal stemmed from his father's incest with Fred's sisters. Fred's youngest brother Doug dismissed these claims as fantasy on Fred's part. By 1957, Fred and his brother John frequently socialised at a youth club in nearby Ledbury, where his distinct and guttural Herefordshire accent marked him as a country bumpkin. He aggressively pestered women and girls, whom he objectified as sources of pleasure to be used as he saw fit, and would abruptly approach and fondle them. When a girl acquiesced to his advances, she would find his sexual performance unsatisfying, as his primary objective was his own gratification. Shortly after his 17th birthday, Fred bought a motorcycle and 2 months later suffered a fractured skull, a broken arm and a broken leg in an accident. He was unconscious for 7 days and walked with braces for several months. Because of this incident, he developed an extreme fear of hospitals and became prone to fits of rage. 2 years later, he suffered a further head injury when a girl he groped on a fire escape outside the Ledbury Youth Club punched him, sending him falling 2 floors. In 1961, Fred's 13-year-old sister Kitty told her mother that Fred had been raping her since the previous December and had impregnated her. Arrested the same month, Fred freely admitted to police he had been molesting young girls since his early teens and asked, "Doesn't everybody do it?" He was tried on 9th of November at Hereford Assizes. Though disgusted by her son's actions, Daisy had been prepared to testify in his defence. Kitty refused to testify and the case collapsed. Much of Fred's family effectively disowned him. His mother banished him from the household, and he moved into the much marked house of his aunt, Violet. But Violet. By mid-1962, he had reconciled with his parents, but his relationship with most of his family remained fraught. So, Fred became reacquainted with Catherine Rena Bernadette Costello in September 1962 when he was 21. He had first met Costello, who came from Coatbridge, Lanarkshire, at Much Market Dance Hall in 1960 and dated her for several months before she returned to Scotland. Costello was pregnant by an Asian bus driver at the time of her marriage to Fred, and may have relocated from Glasgow to England due to members of her family expressing their displeasure at her being pregnant with a mixed-race child. She married Fred in Ledbury on 17th of November, the sole guest being Fred's younger brother John. The couple initially lived in Fred's aunt's home, and then moved to Coatbridge, where Fred worked as an ice cream van driver. Rena's daughter, Charmaine, was born in March 1963. To explain the child's mixed race ancestry, Rena and Fred claimed that she suffered a miscarriage and that Charmaine was adopted. Shortly thereafter, the couple relocated to Savoy Street in the Bridgerton district of Glasgow. In 1964, Rena bore Fred a daughter, Anne-Marie. The child was born at the couple's Savoy Street home. The family nana, Isa McNeil, and neighbours of the West recall Rena as a considerate mother struggling to bring up two children. Fred treated the children harshly. He kept the girls in the bottom of a bunk bed with bars fitted to the space between the bunks, effectively caging them. They were allowed out only when he was at work. Via McNeil, the Wests became acquainted with 16-year-old Anna McFall, a friend of McNeil's who was despondent over the death of her boyfriend in a workplace accident. McFall spent a great deal of time at the West's flat. Fred later admitted to having engaged in numerous affairs in the early years of his marriage and fathered one illegitimate child with a woman from the Gorbals. When Rena discovered her husband's infidelity, she began an affair with a man called John McLaughlin. On one occasion, Fred discovered the pair in an embrace. He punched Rena, making her scream. In response, McLaughlin punched Fred, who drew a knife and grazed McLaughlin's abdomen. When punched by McLaughlin a second time, Fred stopped defending himself. Years later, McLaughlin recollected this incident. He couldn't tackle a man, but he wasn't so slow in attacking women. He and Rena continued their affair, and McLaughlin became increasingly aghast at Rena's bruises and black eyes. On occasion, it became apparent Fred had beaten his wife. McLaughlin extensively beat Fred. Another time, McLaughlin witnessed Charmaine, little older than a toddler, ask Fred for an ice cream from his van. In response, Fred struck her across the head, triggering another beating from McLaughlin. On 4th of November 1965, Fred accidentally ran over and killed a small boy in Glasgow with his van. Fred was cleared of any wrongdoing by police, but feared the hostile reaction and potential reprisal for the accident from the locals, whom he relied upon to make his living. In December, he returned to Gloucester with Charmaine and Marie, renting a caravan at the Timberland Caravan Park in Bishop's Cleeve. Rena joined him in February 1966, accompanied by Isa McNeil and Anna McFall, who moved into Fred's caravan. And a side note, McNeil and McFall both came from impoverished backgrounds. Both hoped to find work in England. Shortly after the move south, Fred found employment driving a lorry for a local abattoir. By early 1966, Fred had begun to exhibit dominance and control over all three women. He was prone to violent mood swings, and Rena and McNeil typically bore the brunt of his fury. Fred also physically attacked his stepdaughter more than once. He is also reported to have begun sexually abusing Charmaine and to have encouraged Rena to turn to prostitution to supplement his meagre income. To escape Fred's domestic abuse and increasingly sadistic demands, Rena phoned McLaughlin begging him to rescue her, McNeil and her children. Together, McLaughlin, Rena and McNeil devised the plan. He and McNeil's boyfriend, John Trotter, would secretly drive to Bishop's Cleeve in McLaughlin's Mini and discreetly take Rena, her children and McNeil back to Scotland. McFall had by this stage become infatuated with Fred, who had promised to marry her. It is likely she informed Fred of the plan as he arrived at the meeting time, and McFall was oddly calm. As she informed McNeil she intended to remain with Fred to work as the children's nanny. An altercation ensued between Fred and McLaughlin, resulting in Fred being struck several times as he clutched onto Charmaine and Anne-Marie. Police were called, and McLaughlin, Trotter, McNeil and Rena left, with Fred threatening to kill Rena should he ever see her again. To ensure her daughter's well-being, Rena frequently travelled to England to visit Charmaine and Anne-Marie while they lived with Fred at Bishop's Cleeve. Despite initially maintaining her friendship with McFall, Rena soon began to resent her matriarchal presence around her daughters. On 11th of October, in an act of resentment, Rena stole some belongings from Fred's caravan and returned to Glasgow. She was arrested the following month and returned to Gloucester to face trial. On 29th of November, Rena was sentenced to 3 years probation. Fred testified at the hearing, admitting he and McFall were living together, but falsely claiming McFall intended to return to Scotland imminently. After the trial, McFall moved into a caravan at the Timberland Caravan Park. Rena alternated between living with Fred and returning to Glasgow. Letters McFall posted to her family and McNeil in Glasgow between 1966 and 1967 indicated she believed a relationship with Fred could offer her a better life than she had experienced in Scotland, and she tried to persuade Fred to divorce his wife in order that he could marry. Now, in July 1967, McFall, aged 18 and 8 months pregnant with Fred's child, vanished. She was never reported missing, but her dismembered remains were found buried at the edge of a cornfield between Muchmarcle and Kempley in June 1994. Her limbs had been carefully disarticulated, and many phalange bones were missing from her body, likely to have been retained as keepsakes. Her unborn child may have been cut from the womb. Fred initially denied that he had killed McFall, but confided to one visitor following his arrest that he had stabbed her to death following an argument. The explanation is inconsistent with the fact that her wrists were found with sections of dressing gown cord wrapped around them, suggesting she had been restrained prior to her murder. The following month, Rena returned to live with Fred, and the couple relocated to the Lake House Caravan Park. Their relationship initially improved, but Rena left the following year, again leaving the children in his care. On this occasion, when Fred had no women to supervise and care for the girls, he temporarily placed them in the care of Gloucester Social Services. Now we go on to the early life of Rose West, or as she was known back then, Rosemary West. Or shall we say, the meeting between them. Fred first encountered Rosemary West in early 1969, shortly after her 15th birthday. The pair first met at Cheltenham bus station. Initially, Rose was repulsed by Fred's unkempt appearance and deduced he was a tramp, but she quickly became flattered by the attention. Fred continued to lavish on her over the following days as he invariably sat alongside her at the same bus stop. Rose twice refused to go on a date with Fred, but allowed him to accompany her home. In their initial conversations, Fred quickly discovered that although Rose had never had a boyfriend, she was overtly promiscuous. He also extracted a degree of sympathy from her by claiming he and his 2 daughters had been abandoned by his wife and that he wished for more children. Having discovered Rose working in a nearby bread shop, a few days after their first encounter, Fred persuaded an unknown woman to enter the premises and present her with a gift, accompanied by the explanation that a man outside had asked her to present this gift to her. Minutes later, Fred entered the premises and asked Rose to accompany him on a date that evening, an offer she accepted. Shortly thereafter, Rose began a relationship with Fred, becoming a frequent visitor at the Lake House Caravan Park and a willing childminder to Charmaine and Anne-Marie, whom she noted were neglected and whom she initially treated with care and affection. On several occasions in the early days of their courtship, Rose insisted that she and Fred take the girls on excursions to gather wild flowers. Within weeks of her first meeting Fred, Rose left her job at the bread shop in order to become the nanny to Charmaine and Anne-Marie. This decision was made with the agreement that Fred would provide her with sufficient money to give to her parents on Fridays to convince them she was still obtaining a salary at the bread shop. Several months later, Rose introduced Fred to her family, who were aghast at their daughter's choice of partner. Rose's mother, Daisy Letts, was unimpressed with Fred's braggadocio and correctly concluded he was a pathological liar. Her father, Bill Letts, a diagnosed schizophrenic who is believed to have molested his daughter, vehemently disapproved of the relationship, threatening Fred directly and promising to call social services if he continued to date his daughter. Rose's parents forbade their daughter from continuing to date Fred, but she defied their wishes, prompting them to visit Gloucestershire social services to explain that their 15-year-old daughter was dating an older man and that they heard rumours that she had begun to engage in prostitution at his caravan. In response, Rose was placed in a home for troubled teenagers in Cheltenham in August 1969 and only allowed to leave under controlled conditions. When allowed to return home to visit her parents at weekends, Rose almost invariably took the opportunity to visit Fred. On her 16th birthday, Rose left the home for troubled teenagers to return to her parents. Fred, at the time serving a 30-day sentence for theft and unpaid fines. Upon Fred's release, Rose left her parents' home to move into the Cheltenham flat Fred then lived in. Shortly thereafter, Fred collected Charmaine and Anne-Marie from the social services. Bill Letts made one final effort to prevent his daughter from seeing Fred, and Rose was examined by a police surgeon in February 1970 to confirm she was pregnant. In response, Rose was again placed into care but was discharged on the 6th of March on the understanding she would terminate her pregnancy and return to her family. Instead, Rose opted to live with Fred, resulting in her father forbidding his daughter from ever setting foot in his household. 3 months later, the couple vacated the Cheltenham flat and relocated to the ground floor flat of a 2-storey house in Midland Road, Gloucester. On 17th of October 1970, Rose gave birth to their first child, a daughter they named Heather Ann. And it's a side note, speculation remains that Heather may have been sired by Rose's own father. 2 months later, Fred was imprisoned for the theft of car tyres and a vehicle tax disc. He remained imprisoned until 24th of June 1971. As he served the 6.5-month sentence, Rose, having just turned 17, looked after the 3 girls, with Charmaine and Anne-Marie being told to refer to Rose as their mother. According to Anne-Marie West, she and Charmaine were frequently subjected to criticism, beatings, and other forms of punishment throughout the time they lived under Rose's care at Midland Road. But although Anne-Marie was generally submissive and prone to display emotion in response to the physical and mental hardship she and her sister endured, Charmaine repeatedly infuriated Rose by her stoic refusal to either cry or display any sign of grief or servitude, no matter how severely she was physically punished. Despite the years of neglect and abuse, Charmaine's spirit had not been broken, and she talked wistfully to Anne-Marie of the belief she held that her mummy would come and save me. Anne-Marie later recollected her sister repeatedly antagonised Rose by making statements such as, "My real mummy wouldn't swear or shout at us," in response to Rose's scathing language. A childhood friend of Charmaine's named Tracy Giles, who had lived in the upper flat of Midland Road, would later recollect an incident in which he had entered the west flat unannounced, only to see Charmaine naked and standing up on a chair, gagged and with her hands bound behind her with a belt, as Rose stood along the child with a large wooden spoon in her hand. According to Giles, Charmaine had been calm and unconcerned, while Anne-Marie had been standing by the door with a blank expression on her face. Hospital records revealed Charmaine had received treatment for a severe puncture wound to her left ankle in the casualty unit of the Gloucester Royal Hospital on 28th of March 1971. This incident was explained by Rose to have resulted from a household incident. Rose is believed to have killed Charmaine shortly before Fred's prison release date of 24th of June 1971. She is known to have taken Charmaine, Anne-Marie and Heather to visit Fred on 15th of June. It is believed to be on or very shortly after this date that Charmaine was murdered, as well as forensic odontology confirmed that Charmaine had died while Fred was still incarcerated. Further testimony from Charles's mother Shirley, corroborated the fact that Charmaine had been murdered before Fred had been released on 24th of June. In her later testimony at Rose's trial, Shirley Giles stated that she and her family had lived in the upper flat of 25 Midland Road in 1971, and that her two daughters had been playmates of Charmaine and Anne-Marie. Shirley Giles stated that her family had vacated the upper flat on Midland Road in April 1971. On one day in June, she had brought Tracy to visit Charmaine, only for Tracy to be told by Rose she had gone to live with her mother and bloody good riddance before Tracy began to weep. As with the Giles family, Rose explained Charmaine's disappearance to others who inquired about her whereabouts by claiming that Rena had called and taken her eldest daughter to live with her in Bristol. She informed staff at Charmaine's primary school that the child had moved with her mother to London. When Fred was released from prison on 24th of June, he allayed Anne-Marie's concerns for her sister's whereabouts by claiming her mother had collected Charmaine and returned to Scotland. In her autobiography, Out of the Shadows, Anne-Marie recollected that when she asked why her mother had collected Charmaine and not her, Fred callously replied, "She wouldn't want you, love, you're the wrong colour." Charmaine's body was initially stowed in the coal cellar of Midland Road until Fred was released from prison. He later buried her naked body in the yard close to the back door of the flat, and he remained adamant he had not dismembered her. A subsequent autopsy suggested that the body had been severed at the hip. This damage may have been caused by building work Fred conducted at the property in 1976. Several bones, particularly patella, finger, wrist, toe and ankle bones, were missing from her skeleton, leading to the speculation the missing parts had been retained as keepsakes. This proved to be a distinctive discovery in all the autopsies of the victims exhumed in 1994. Now, Rena maintained sporadic contact with her children. On each occasion, she and Fred separated. She is also known to have visited Moorcourt Cottage to inquire as to her children's whereabouts and welfare in the later half of August 1971. Fred's sister-in-law, Christine, later recalled Rena was depressed and extremely anxious about her children's welfare. Being provided with Fred's Midland Road address, Rena sought to confront him, likely to discuss or demand custody of her daughters. This was the final time Rena was seen alive. She is believed to have been murdered by strangulation, possibly in the backseat of Fred's Ford Poplar and likely while intoxicated. When her body was discovered, a short length of metal tubing was found with her remains, leaving an equal possibility she had been restrained and subjected to a sexual assault prior to murder. Rena's body was extensively dismembered, placed into plastic bags and buried close to a cluster of trees known as Yew Tree Coppice at Letterbox Field, about 1 mile, 1.6 kilometres from Much Market. On 29th of January 1972, Fred and Rose were married. The ceremony took place at Gloucester Register Office, with Fred incorrectly describing himself as a bachelor upon the marriage certificate. No family or friends were invited apart from Fred's brother John, who acted as best man. Several months later, with Rose pregnant with a second child, the couple moved from Midland Road to an address nearby, the infamous 25 Cromwell Street. Initially, the 3-storey home was rented from the council. Fred later purchased the property from the council for £7,000. To facilitate the Wests purchasing the property from the council, many of the upper floor rooms were initially converted into bedsit to supplement the household income. To maintain a degree of privacy from his own family, Fred installed a cooker and a wash basin on the first floor landing in order that their lodgers need not enter the ground floor where the West family lived, and only he and his family were permitted to access the garden of the property. On 1st of June, Rose gave birth to a second daughter. The date of her birth led Fred and Rose to name the child May June. So up to this far, we have seen 2 killings have already happened. But now, shortly after giving birth to her second child, Rose began to work as a prostitute, operating from an upstairs room at their residence and advertising her services in a local contact magazine. Fred encouraged Rose to seek clients in Gloucester's West Indian community through these adverts. In addition to her prostitution, Rose engaged in casual sex with both male and female lodgers within their household, and individuals Fred encountered via his work. She had also bragged to several people that no man or woman could completely satisfy her. When engaging in sexual relations with women, Rose would gradually increase the level of brutality to which he subjected her partner with acts such as partially suffocating her partner or inserting increasingly large dildos into her partner's body. If the woman insisted or expressed any pain or fear, this would greatly excite Rose, who would typically ask, aren't you woman enough to take it? To many of these women, it became apparent Rose and her husband, who regularly participated in threesomes with his wife and her lovers, took a particular pleasure in seeking to take women beyond their sexual limits, typically via sessions involving bondage, as well as the West openly admitted to taking a particular pleasure from any form of sex involving a strong measure of dominance, pain, and violence. To cater to these fetishes, they amassed a large collection of bondage and restraining devices. Magazines and photographs later expanding this collection to include videos depicting bestiality and graphic child sexual abuse. Rose controlled the West family finances, Fred giving her his pay packets. The room Rose used for prostitution was known throughout the West household as Rose's room, and had several hidden peepholes allowing Fred, a long-time voyeur, to watch her entertain her clients. He also installed a baby monitor in the room, allowing him to listen from elsewhere in the house. The room included a private bar and a red light outside the door warned when Rose was not to be disturbed. Rose carried the sole key to this room around her neck, and Fred installed a separate doorbell to the household which Rose's clients were instructed to ring whenever they visited the household. Much of the money earned from Rose's prostitution was spent on her home improvements. By 1977, Rose's father had come to tolerate his daughter's marriage and to develop a grudging respect for Fred. Together he and Fred opened a cafe they named the Green Lantern, which was soon insolvent. When Bill Letts discovered Rose's prostitution, he would also visit to have sex with his daughter. But in 1983, she had given birth to 8 children, at least 3 of whom were conceived by clones. Fred willingly accepted these children as his own and falsely informed them the reason their skin was darker than that of their siblings was because of his great-grandmother, who was a black woman. So, when each of the West children reached the age of 7, they were assigned numerous daily chores to perform in the house. They were seldom allowed to socialise outside the household perimeters unless either Fred or Rose were present, and had to follow strict guidelines imposed by their parents, with severe punishment, almost always physical, being the penalty for not conforming to the household rules. The children feared being the recipient of violence from their parents, the vast majority inflicted by Rose, occasionally by Fred. The violence was sometimes irrational, indiscreet, or just inflicted for Rose's gratification. She always took great care not to mark the children's faces or hands in these assaults. However, Heather, then her younger brother Stephen, born in 1973, ran away from home. Both returned to Cromwell Street after several weeks of alternately sleeping rough or staying with friends, and both were beaten when they returned. Between 1972 and 1992, the West children were admitted to the accident and emergency departments of local hospitals 31 times. The injuries were explained as accidents and never reported to social services. On one occasion, as Stephen was mopping the kitchen floor with a cloth, Rose accidentally stepped into the bowl of water he had been using. In response, Rose hit the boy over the head with the bowl, then repeatedly kicked him in the head and chest as she shouted, "You did that on purpose, you little swine." On another occasion, Rose became furious after a missing kitchen utensil, then grabbed a knife she'd been using to cut a slab of meat, repeatedly inflicting light scour marks to May's chest, until her ribcage was covered with light knife wounds. All the while, May screamed, "No, Mom, no, Mom," as Stephen and Heather stood by helplessly sobbing. Even Fred and occasionally became the recipient of Rose's violence. On one occasion, in August 1974, Rose chased after Fred with a carving knife in her hand. Fred was able to slam the door of the front room into which he had run as Rose lunged at him with the knife, resulting in the knife embedding itself in the door and three of Rose's fingers sliding down the blade, almost severing them from her hand. In response, Rose calmly wrapped her hand in a towel and said, "Look what you've done, fella. You've got to take me to the hospital now." So as was mentioned, we're going to get into some of the graphic stuff now. So, into the crimes. In September 1972, the Wests led 8-year-old Anne-Marie to the cellar at 25 Cromwell Street, where the child was gagged, ordered to undress, with Rose tearing her dress from her body upon noticing the child's hesitation. She then stripped naked, bound to a mattress, and gagged her before Fred raped her, with Rose's active encouragement. After the rape, Rose explained to the child, "Everyone does it to every girl. Everybody does it to every girl. It's a father's job. Don't worry and don't say anything to anybody," making clear these sexual assaults would continue. Fred and Rose then threatened the child with severe beatings if they ever received word she had divulged the sexual abuse she endured at their hands. Rose occasionally sexually abused Anne-Marie herself and later took extreme gratification in degrading her with acts such as binding Anne-Marie to various items of furniture before encouraging Fred to rape her and forcing her to perform household chores while wearing sexual devices and a mini skirt. From the age of 13, Fred and Rose forced Anne-Marie to prostitute herself within the household, with her parents being informed Anne-Marie was 16. Rose was always present in the room when these acts occurred to ensure Anne-Marie did not reveal her true age. On one occasion, when Anne-Marie was 13 or 14, Rose took her to a local pub, insisting she drink several glasses of barley wine. Several hours later, Fred arrived at the pub to collect Rose and Anne-Marie. Once they had left the premises, Anne-Marie was bundled into her father's van and beaten by Rose, who asked her, "Do you think you could be my friend?" before she was sexually abused by her father and stepmother. Now, in October 1972, the Wests hired 17-year-old Caroline Owens as their children's nanny. They had picked her up one night on a secluded country road as she hitchhiked from Tewkesbury to her Cinderford home, having visited her boyfriend. Learning that Owens disliked her stepfather and was looking for a job, the Wests offered her part-time employment as a nanny to the 3 children, then in their household, with a promise she would be driven home each Tuesday. Several days later, Owens moved into 25 Cromwell Street, sharing a room with Anne-Marie, whom Owens noticed was very withdrawn. Rose had begun to engage in prostitution by this time and explained to Owens that she worked as a masseuse when the younger woman inquired about the steady stream of men visiting him. According to Owens, Fred also said she was a skilled abortionist who was available should she ever need such a service. Owens also noticed Fred talk about sex almost incessantly. Her suspicions as to sexual overtones were further heightened when Fred boasted that many of the women he claimed to have performed abortion upon were so overjoyed that they would offer him their sexual services as a reward. When Owens herself became the recipient of the West's overt sexual advances, she announced her intentions to leave Cromwell Street and return home. Knowing Owens' habit of hitchhiking along the A40 between Cinderford and Tewkesbury, the Wests formulated the plan to abduct her for their shared gratification. Fred later admitted that the specific intent of this abduction was the rape and not the murder of Owens, but his initial incentive was to determine whether his wife would be willing to at least assist him in his abduction. On the 6th of December 1972, the couple lured Owens into their vehicle with an apology for their conduct and the offer of a lift home. Initially, Owens believed the Wests had been sincere in their apologies to her and obliged, believing she had simply mistaken their earlier intentions. Rose joined her in the back seat with the explanation she wanted a girl's chat as Fred drove. Shortly thereafter, Rose began to fondle her as Fred questioned her if she had had sex with her boyfriend that evening. When Owens began to protest, Fred stopped the car, referred to Owens as a bitch, and punched her into unconsciousness before he and Rose bound and gagged her with a scarf and duct tape. In a subsequent statement to police, Owens stated that at Cromwell Street she was given a drugged cup of tea to drink, and then again gagged and subjected to a prolonged sexual assault from Fred and Rose. At one stage, Fred remarked that Owens' clitoris was unusual, then lashed her genitals with a leather belt. When Owens screamed, Rose again smothered her with a pillow and further restrained her about the neck and performed sexual acts on her. Quickly realizing the gravity of her situation, Owens ceased resisting their sexual assaults. The following morning, having noted Owens screaming when one of his children knocked on the door of the room in which she was sustained, Fred threatened that he and his wife would keep her locked up in the cellar and allow his black friends to abuse her, and that when they had finished he would bury her body beneath the paving stones of Gloucester. Fred then claimed he had killed hundreds of young girls, adding that Owens had primarily been brought to the house for Rose's pleasure. He and Rose then calmly asked Owens whether she would consider returning to work as their nanny. Seeing her escape avenue, Owens agreed and vacuumed the house to indicate her belief in becoming an extended member of the family. Later that day, Owens escaped from a laundrette she and Rose had entered and returned home. Although initially too ashamed to divulge to her mother what had happened, when her mother noted the welts, bruises, and exposed subcutaneous tissues of her daughter's body, Owens burst into tears and confided what happened. Owens' mother returned immediately. Owens' mother immediately reported her daughter's ordeal to the police, and the Wests were arrested and charged with assault, indecent assault, actual bodily harm, and rape. The case was tried at Gloucester Magistrate Court on 12th of January 1973, but by this date Owens had decided she could not face the ordeal of testifying in court. All charges pertaining to her sexual abuse were dropped, and the Wests agreed to plead guilty to the reduced charges of indecent insult and causing actual bodily harm. Each were fined £50 and the couple were allowed to walk free from court. When Owens heard this news, tragically, she attempted suicide. So, now we get on to the murders. 3 months after the West's assault trial, the couple committed their first known murder. The victim was a 19-year-old named Linda Goff, with whom Fred and Rose became acquainted, through a major lodger in 1973. Goff regularly visited Cromwell Street and engaged in affairs with 2 male lodgers. On 19th of April, she moved into their home on Cromwell Street on or about 20th April. Other tenants were told that she had been told to leave the house after she had hit one of their children. The story was repeated to Goff's mother when she contacted the Wests to inquire about her whereabouts. Rose had been wearing Linda's clothing when she repeated this claim. When Goff's dismembered body was found, the drawer was completely wrapped in adhesive and surgical tape to silence her screams, and 2 small tubes had likely been inserted into her nasal cavities to allow breathing. Long sections of string and sections of knotted fabric were discovered with her remains. Goff had likely been suspended from holes carved in the wooden beams supporting the ceiling of the cellar. Fred later admitted that he had devised for the purpose of suspending his victims' bodies and likely died of either strangulation or suffocation. Her dismembered body, missing 5 cervical vertebrae, a patella, and numerous phalange bones, were buried in an inspection pit beneath the garage. For their later investigations, police and forensic experts concluded all the victims found in the cellar at 10 Cromwell Street had been murdered in the location, and that, like Goff, each had been dismembered in this location. 5 victims were murdered and buried in the cellar at Cromwell Street between November 1973 and April 1975. The first of these victims, 15-year-old Carol Ann Cooper, was abducted on 10th of November 1973. Cooper lived in the Pines Children's Home in Worcester and was abducted after spending the evening at a cinema with her boyfriend. She had been waiting for a bus in Warndon when she vanished and was lightly dragged into Fred's car, when her face was bound with surgical tape and her arms bound with braiding cloth, before she was driven to Cromwell Street at the West's address. Cooper was suspended from the wooden beam of the cellar ceiling before her abuse and murder. As been the case with Linda, Cooper died from strangulation or asphyxiation before her body was dismembered and buried in a shallow cubicle grave in the cellar. And over the following 17 months, 4 further victims between the age of 15 and 21 suffered a similar fate to that endured by Goff and Cooper, although the disarticulation conducted upon each successive victim, plus the paraphernalia discovered in each shallow grave, suggested each victim was likely subjected to greater abuse and torture than those previously murdered. Following the murder of 18-year-old Juanita Mott in 1975, Fred concreted over the floor of the entire cellar. He later converted this section of the household into a bedroom for his oldest children, and he and his wife are not known to have committed any further murders until May 1978, when Fred, either with or without Rose's participation, but certainly with her knowledge, murdered an 18-year-old lodger named Shirley Robinson. Robinson had taken lodgings with the Wests in April 1977 and was heavily pregnant at the time of her murder. Although Rose, herself pregnant at the time, initially boasted to neighbours the child Robinson was carrying was her husband's, she soon developed a deep resentment of Robinson, and the motive for her murder is likely to have been the removal of a threat to the stability of the West relationship. Her body was buried in the garden of 25 Cromwell Street. It was extensively dismembered, but no restraining devices were found with these remains, making a sexual motive for this murder unlikely. The unborn baby had been removed and had several bones missing. Shortly thereafter, Rose unsuccessfully submitted a claim for maternity benefits in Shirley's name with Gloucester Social Services. As had earlier been the case with Charmaine and Linda, Fred and Rose allayed the suspicions of anyone who asked about Robinson's whereabouts by claiming she had relocated to live with her father in West Germany. The final murder Fred and Rose are known to have committed with a definite sexual motive occurred on the 5th of August 1979. The victim was a 16-year-old named Alison Chambers, who had run away from a local children's home to become the West's live-in nanny in the middle of 1979. Chambers is believed to have lived within their household for several weeks before her murder, and Rose promised Chambers she could live at a rural peaceful farm she claimed she and Fred owned. Her body was also buried in the garden of Cromwell Street, close to the bathroom wall, and although Chambers was likely dismembered, her skeleton was not marked by striations as the earlier victims' bodies had been. In an effort to allay any concerns from Chambers' family, with whom she maintained regular correspondence, Fred and Rose later posted a letter written by Chambers to her mother prior to her murder from a Northamptonshire post box. Now we go back to abuse within the family. Heather and Mae West became the focus of Fred's incestuous sexual attentions after Anne-Marie ran away from home in 1979, after enduring particularly severe beating from Rose to her stomach just days after being discharged from hospital for treatment of an ectopic pregnancy. The frequency of the abuse endured by Heather and Mae increased when both girls reached puberty. Fred was overt and unapologetic in his conduct and would justify his actions with a similar explanation: "I made you, I can do what I like with you." He further referred to his intentions to impregnate both his daughters on at least one occasion, and would occasionally force all his children to watch pornography with him. As Heather, Mae and their younger children and their younger brother Stephen was very close in age, the trio resolved that if their father asked either of the two girls to be alone in a room with him, they would only do so if at least one other member of the trio were present to avoid either girl being raped. Both girls also developed a regime whereby they would only shower or undress when their father was either out of the house or as her sister stood guard at the door. Stephen was also informed by his father that he would have to have sex with his mother by the age of 17 in the event his parents evicted him from their home when he was 16. Although the girls were repulsed by their father's behaviour, May, having once endured Fred throwing the vacuum cleaner at her when she remonstrated against his fondling her, developed a mechanism whereby she would tolerate Fred sexually fondling her and jokingly brush aside any efforts he made to take the molestation further. Whereas in her autobiography, May recollected that Heather was affected quite badly by all of this, even more than me. Strong suspicion remains that by 1985 or 1986, Heather had been forced to engage in intercourse with her father, as by the mid-1980s she developed classic symptoms of the distress felt by victims of child abuse. These included habits of biting her nails until they bled, drinking alcohol, or rarely watching her father through the corner of her eye, whether she was sitting or standing, expressing nervous fragility and manoeuvring in the presence of moans, sleep being repeated broken by nightmares, and her repeatedly bouncing back and forth as she sat in a chair. This distressful behaviour led to Fred and Rose suspecting Heather had lesbian inclinations, and also resulting in her becoming the increasing recipient of taunts from her father, who had never particularly held a liking towards Heather, that she was ugly and a bitch. On the occasions Heather demonstrated about the abuse to her mother, Rose would simply laugh at her distress. Heather also expressed to May and Stephen her desire to run away and live a nomadic lifestyle in the Forest of Dean and to never see any human beings. Well, that was, of course, never to take form, because Heather did complain to friends about the abuse she and her siblings endured, and her external signs of psychological distress were noted by several of them. Staff at the Hucklecote Secondary School, which Heather and her siblings attended, also known to have expressed concerns as to why Heather, a studious and obedient pupil, refused to obey orders either to change her clothing for or shower after sporting activities. On one occasion, she was forced to take a shower, resulting in her peers and staff noting her arms, legs, and torso were covered in welts and bruises in various stages of healing. Heather attempted to excuse these injuries as having been obtained in fights with her siblings, but confided in one close friend that they had been inflicted by her parents, adding that her mother considered her a little bitch who deserved her beatings. By the mid-1980s, rumours of Rose's sex life had reached several of the children's classmates, and although the rest children had been instructed never to divulge details of their home lives to their peers, Heather confided to her friends that many of these rumours were true. The father of one of his classmates was a friend of the rest. As such, word soon reached Fred and Rose that Heather had divulged the details of her home life, including details of her mother's promiscuity to her classmates. Fred was so concerned by these revelations that he began to escort Heather to and from school. After Heather left school in 1986, she applied for numerous jobs in an effort to leave Cromwell Street. By June of the following year, she had pinned her hopes on escaping the household by obtaining a job as a chalet cleaner at a holiday camp in the seaside town of Torquay. She received notification that this application had been successful on June 18th. In response, she crumbled into tears before her siblings, May and Stephen. That same evening, the whole family heard Heather sobbing aloud as she attempted to sleep, and according to May, she cried all the way through the night. The following morning, on 19th of June, Heather was back to her usual self, looking miserable, biting her nails and sitting on the couch, bouncing back and forth. Siblings left the house to go to school. When Heather's siblings returned home, they were informed that Heather had left to accept the job she had previously been refused in Torquay. Although Rose told an inquiring neighbour that she and Heather had had a hell of a row and that Heather had run away from home. Later, to answer their children's questions about why Heather failed to contact or visit her siblings, the parents claimed that Heather had eloped with a lesbian mother. When May and Steve suggested they report Heather's disappearance to the police, Fred changed his story yet again, saying it would be unwise to initiate a search of Heather as she was involved in credit card fraud. On more than one occasion, Fred and Rose persuaded an unknown acquaintance to fake a phone call from Heather to her parents. In the years following Heather's disappearance, Fred occasionally jokingly threatened the children that they would end up under the patio like Heather if they ever misbehaved or divulged the mistreatment they endured to anyone outside the household. With Rose's approval, He later constructed a barbecue pit immediately opposite where Heather had been buried, and placed a pine table on her grave for the children and family to sit upon whenever the West held family gatherings in their garden. Heather's disappearance, Fred and Rose's constantly changing stories about their daughter's whereabouts, plus their allusions to foul play, ultimately led police inquiries as to Heather's whereabouts. These inquiries culminated in a search warrant being issued to excavate the West's garden in February 1944, and this would of course lead to the full horror of exactly what went down at 25 Monmouth Street, and we get into that now. In May 1992, Fred asked his 13-year-old daughter Louise to bring some bottles to a room on the first floor of their home. Rose was not present in the home at the time. Shortly thereafter, the girl's siblings heard her scream, "No, don't." Later, Fred returned downstairs. Later was found by her siblings, writhing in pain, sobbing that her father had raped and sodomized her at one stage, partially strangling her. When Rose returned home, Louise confided in her mother that she'd been raped by Fred. Rose replied, "Oh well, you were asking for it." Over the weeks, Louise was raped on 3 further occasions, with Rose personally witnessing one of these rapes before following her distressed and bleeding daughter into the bathroom and asking the child, "Well, what did you expect?" Fred also filmed one of these rapes. Several weeks later, Louise garnered the courage to confide in a close friend what her father had done. This friend told her mother what had happened on the 4th of August. In response, the friend's mother anonymously informed the police. On the 6th of August 1992, the police searched the West household on the pretext of searching for stolen property. Although numerous objects of sexual paraphernalia, including 99 pornographic videos of both homemade and commercial nature, were discovered, police did not find a video depicting the rape of Fred's daughter. The 13-year-old made a full statement to go through a specially trained solicitor describing her father's actions, the fact that the sexual abuse had begun when she was 11, and that her mother had been casually indifferent to her plight. All the children in the household were placed in foster care the following day. Medical examinations revealed evidence of physical and sexual abuse. The West children also divulged their mother had inflicted most of the physical abuse, and that their father frequently said if they had told anyone about the goings-on in the household, that they would be buried under the patio like their sister had. Police began a full-scale investigation, eventually leading to Fred being charged with 3 counts of rape and 1 of robbery, with Rose as an accomplice. She was also charged with child cruelty, inciting her husband to engage in sex with their daughter and obstructing the police. Fred and Rose were questioned as to their whereabouts of their eldest daughter, and although Fred claimed Heather was alive and well and supporting herself by prosecution, Rose initially claimed to have no knowledge of Heather's whereabouts or why she had left home. She claimed on the 11th of August that she could remember now that her daughter had left home at her own persuasion due to Rose's concerns her other children may discover Heather's supposed lesbian inclinations. Rose then added that she had also given her daughter £600 to incentive her to leave the household before, further claiming to have maintained sporadic telephone contact with her daughter over the years. The following day, Rose was granted bail on the condition she did not maintain contact with the children, her stepdaughter, or her husband prior to upcoming trial. As Fred awaited trial, he was held on remand here in Birmingham. Learning that her father had denied any wrongdoing, Anne-Marie also contacted police to offer a full statement detailing her experiences as a child. In a statement given to Detective Constable Hazel Savage, Anne-Marie recounted the extensive physical, mental and sexual abuse she had endured as a child at the hands of her father and stepmother, before agreeing to testify against both parents at their upcoming trial. Anne-Marie also added she had for several years been unsuccessfully attempting to trace her mother Rena and half-sisters Charmaine and Heather. Further inquiries conducted with Anne-Marie's husband, Chris Davis, revealed that Heather had confided in him just how unhappy she was shortly before her disappearance and her desire to leave home. Davis elaborated that although Heather had not divulged any details about her enduring any sexual abuse, he had been so concerned for her welfare he had offered to confront Fred and Rose, and Heather dissuaded him from doing so, blurting, "For Christ's sake, don't, because they'll kill us both." Davis then suggested they might wish to speak with Heather to garner further details of her abuse. In their efforts To gather further evidence, police and social services also spoke with May, who, having spoken with her 13-year-old sister and learned Louise did not wish to see her father charged, initially denied she had enjoyed any molestation as an adolescent. Police then focused their attention on tracing Heather in efforts to corroborate Anne-Marie's claims of sexual abuse, but inquiries to the Inland Revenue and the Social Security Department have no records attesting to her being alive. 2 months later, Gloucester Social Services also contacted police to stress their concerns over the whereabouts of Heather. The case against the Wests collapsed when Anne-Marie and her 13-year-old half-sister Louise declined to testify at the court case on the 7th of June 1993. The child rape victim expressing her desire to return to her family and Anne-Marie choosing to withdraw her statement because of her noting the misery of her younger siblings and her fear of Rose's vindictiveness. Shortly thereafter, Anne-Marie spoke further with DC Savage, further emphasising that her mother Rena and her half-sister Charmaine were also missing. Although the Wests were acquitted of all charges, all of their younger children remained in foster care, albeit with permitted supervision visitations to Cromwell Street. Despite Fred and Rose claiming that the few relatives from whom they were not already estranged by 1993 that the charges had been fabricated by police, almost all of their remaining family members severed contact with them. Meanwhile, police continued investigating the disappearance of Heather, noting no record existed indicating she was alive. When Anne-Marie was questioned as to the colloquial family joke regarding Heather being buried under the patio, she confirmed that the sole time she had heard her father cite this claim, he had immediately burst into laughter, leading to her refusing to take this claim seriously. In retracing Fred's history, police also discovered that although Rena and Charmaine had disappeared in 1971, no missing person report had ever been filed on either of them. DC Savage and her colleagues were convinced Heather was dead and that Fred's repeated statement to his children that her body lay beneath the family patio might be true. On 23rd of February 1994, Gloucester police successfully applied for a search warrant authorising the search of 25 Cromwell Street to locate Heather's remains. When police displayed this warrant to Rose on 24th of February, she turned pale before becoming hysterical and shouting over her shoulder to her eldest son Stephen, "Get Fred." Rose became contradictory in her informal questioning as to the circumstances surrounding Heather's disappearance. When reminded of these contradictions, she became distraught and abusive, shouting to the officers, "I can't fucking remember, it's a bloody long time ago. What do you think I am, a bloody computer?" Fred had been working in Stroud at the time. Upon hearing of the police's intentions, he assured Stephen he would be home immediately. When Fred arrived 3 hours later, he informed his family of his intentions to voluntarily offer a witness statement to police regarding his daughter's whereabouts. Despite Fred's insistence in this statement that Heather had been alive and well, albeit involved in a drugs cartel, and that the claims he and his wife had made to her being buried beneath the family patio were simply rubbish, police unassuaged. In response, Fred abruptly changed tactics, claiming they had simply held a grudge against him due to his 1993 acquittal of the rape of his daughter. That evening, with the search team having left their premises and a uniformed officer remaining at Cromwell Street to guard the excavation site, May and Stephen observed their parents talking in hushed tones as they repeatedly glanced towards the garden from their kitchen window. In the early hours of the following morning, as his son Stephen was about to leave for work, Fred informed him, "Look, son, look after Mom and sell the house. I've done something really bad. I want you to go to the papers and make as much money as you can." Shortly thereafter, police returned to Cromwell Street to continue the search for Heather's body. Upon their arrival, Fred indicated he wished to be arrested for Heather's murder and to be taken to Bearland Police Station to provide a full confession. He was then arrested and formally cautioned. At 11:15 that morning, Fred formally admitted to police he had indeed killed his daughter, albeit in an act of manslaughter. He confessed to strangling Heather in a fit of rage and dismembering her body in the ground floor bathroom with a heavy serrated knife. he normally used for cutting slabs or frozen meat. Her remains had been stored in a dustbin as he waited for an opportunity to dig her grave. Fred was insistent his wife had no knowledge of her daughter's murder, claiming he had committed the murder as Rose was preoccupied with one of their crimes, adding the fact the search team had not yet unearthed Heather's remains was because they had been excavating the wrong section of the garden. He then volunteered to accompany the police to the house to pinpoint the precise location of Heather's body. Upon receipt of this confession, Fred's solicitor Howard Ogden and his appointed adult, Janet Leach, informed May and Stephen that their father had confessed to their sister's murder. In response, Stephen slumped against the wall and began sobbing. May entered a state of shock before stammering that her father had not killed his sister. The following day, being the 26th of February, police began excavating the section of the garden at Cromwell Street where Fred indicated he had buried his daughter's body. Shortly after 4 p.m, police found a human thigh bone protruding from a section of the garden. Fred had insisted police need to not look in. Excavating the section of the garden where Fred had indicated that he had buried his daughter's body, investigators discovered a mass of jumbled human remains encased in the remnants of a bin bag and intertwined with 2 lengths of rope. These dismembered remains were taken to the police headquarters for further examination, where they were determined to be those of a young woman with 1 kneecap and several phalanges missing. Their decadent fingernails were discovered in a pile, suggesting that they had been torn from her neck fingers as a means of torture. Several hours later, the body was identified by dental records as being that of Heather West. That evening, having been formally charged with his daughter's murder and questioned as to why police had also discovered a 3rd thigh bone, Fred confessed there were 2 further sets of human remains in his garden and agreed to return to Cromwell Street to reveal the location of both graves, one of whom he named as Shirley Robinson, whom he described as being a former tenant and a lesbian who had been heavily pregnant with his child at the time of the 1978 murder. The other victim he described incorrectly as being Shirley's mate, but could not or would not elaborate as to her identity. Both sets of remains were discovered on February 28th of February, and Fred was charged with both murders 2 days later. Having discovered 3 sets of human remains in the garden, a decision was made to thoroughly search the entire property. Rose was placed in a safe house in the nearby town of Dursley as police commenced their search inside 25 Cromwell Street. Informed of this fact, and with the formal interviews conducted by the investigation team lasting up to 16 hours each day and including persistent questions as to the whereabouts of his first wife, Rena, and stepdaughter Charmaine, Fred authorised his solicitor to pass a note he had written to the leader of the murder investigation, Superintendent John Bennett of the Gloucestershire Police. This note read, "I, Frederick West, authorise my solicitor, Howard Ogden, to advise Superintendent Bennett that I wish to admit a further approximate 9 killings, expressly Charmaine, Rena, Linda Goff, and others to be identified F. West." Questioned further as to his claims, Fred calmly explained that there was a further 5 bodies buried in his cellar and a 6th body beneath the ground floor bathroom. Most of these victims, Fred claimed, had been hitchhikers or girls he had murdered in the 1970s after picking them up at bus stops. Initially, Fred claimed these 6 victims had been killed when they had threatened to inform Rose of his infidelity with women and that he had to transport their bodies to Cromwell Street to abuse, dismember and bury in shallow graves. The dismemberment, Fred claimed, had made it easier to bury the remains in shallow cubical graves, and he agreed to return to Cromwell Street to indicate precisely where he had buried each victim. Between the 5th and the 8th of March, police found 6 further bodies of young females at 25 Cromwell Street. Each victim had been extensively mutilated, and each body bore evidence of having been subjected to extreme sexual abuse prior to the act of murder. For example, the 3rd set of remains discovered in the cellar was found with a length of cloth wrapped around the skull and an oval of adhesive tape 16 inches in circumference found with the remains had likely been used to gag this victim, whose ankles and wrists were also found with a large section of rope. Also found in this grave was a large serrated knife. A 2nd set of remains were found with a section of tubing twisted into a U shape alongside her severed limbs. and her skull was found encased in adhesive tape which had been wrapped around the section where her face had been 11 or 12 times, with a narrow plastic tube inserted where the nasal cavities had been in an effort to allow her to breathe prior to her murder. Each set of remains were missing numerous bones, particularly phalanges. When questioned, Fred refused to divulge the reason or whereabouts of the bones missing from each set of remains. Despite Fred's insistence that his wife had no knowledge of any of the murders, investigators suspected otherwise. Rose was arrested on the 20th of April 1994, initially on offences relating to the rape of an 11-year-old girl and the physical assault of an 8-year-old boy, both charges dating from the mid-1970s. The following day, she was refused bail and transferred to Church Prison to be held in the maximum security ring. Here she was questioned more closely about the murders, in particular those of her daughter Heather and Linda Goff, and on the 25th, she was formally charged with Goff's murder. By 6th of May, Fred and Rose were jointly charged with 5 counts of murder, with Rose simply replying, "I'm innocent," upon hearing each formal charge, a response that proved to be a theme throughout each of the 46 interviews investigators held with Rose prior to her trial. As well as the murders of the victims exhumed from Cromwell Street, Fred had confessed to the murders of his first wife and stepdaughter, and to knowing the location of Anna McFall's remains, although he always denied killing her. Fred agreed to identify each location, and the remains were unearthed between the 10th of April and 7th of June. He was then transferred to Birmingham's Winson Green prison, where a strict suicide watch called for his cell to be checked every 15 minutes. Fred and Rose West were brought before a magistrate's court in Gloucester on 30th of June 1994. He was charged with 11 murders and she was 9. This was the first time the couple had been seen since Fred's February arrest. Prior to hearing the formal charges against them, Fred leaned towards his wife and gently placed his hand upon her shoulder. In response, Rose, having ignored her husband's presence, visibly winced in discomfort. Both were ordered held on remand. Police attempted to lead Fred from the hearing. He resisted their efforts and again attempted to move towards Rose, who again winced and attempted to writhe away from his grasp. Immediately after his court appearance, Fred was rearrested on suspicion of murdering Anna McFall, whose body was found on the 7th of June, but had not been officially identified until this date. He was formally charged with McFall's murder on the 3rd of July, appearing in court the following morning. As he was held on remand at Winson Green prison in the months following his arrest, Fred became increasingly depressed. This became worse after Rose's public rejection of him at Gloucester Magistrate Court. On the 30th of June, her refusal to reply to letters he sent her and reports leaked to the press in which she, Rose, had assumed the role of a grieving mother who had lost a daughter and stepdaughter to her husband, and in which she declared both her innocence of murder and her hatred of him. Fred pleaded with Stephen and Anne-Marie, the only children to visit their father following remand, to convey to Rose that he loved her, but Rose never acknowledged these overtures. In response, Fred withdrew his earlier confession to having acted alone in the murders and instead accused his wife of almost total culpability in all of the murders to which he had been charged, excluding that of Anna McFall, which he claimed had been committed by his first wife. The initially strict suicide watch having been relaxed on the 1st of January 1995, on July 1995, Fred West hung himself in his cell by wrapping an improvised rope he had constructed from a blanket and tags he'd stolen from prison laundry bags around his neck, and then binding this device to a door handle and window catchment and sinking to his knees. At the bottom of the suicide note found in the cell was a drawing of a gravestone within which was written, "In loving memory, Rose West, rest in peace where no shadows fall, in perfect peace he waits for Rose, his wife." At pretrial proceedings in February, Rose pleaded not guilty to 10 charges of murder. The murder of Charmaine West had been added to the original line after Fred's suicide and 2 counts of rape and indecent assault of young girls having been dropped to the view for later resubmission. Though her counsel conceded that circumstantial evidence indicated Rose's willingness to subject young girls to sadistic physical and sexual abuse, Her trial at Winchester Crown Court began on the 3rd of October. An important early decision by the judge was to admit testimony related to the sexual mistreatment of 3 women by Fred and Rose, accepting the prosecution's argument that it established a pattern of behaviour repeated in the murders. So, after 7 weeks of evidence, the judge instructed the jury, emphasising that circumstantial evidence can be sufficient for a finding of guilt, and that if 2 people take a part in a murder, the law considers them equally guilty, regardless of which of them did the deed. On the 21st and 22nd of November, the jury returned unanimous guilty verdicts for all 10 murders, terming her appalling and depraved. The judge sentenced Rosemary to life in prison, emphasising that she should never be paroled. Initially, Rose was incarcerated at HMP Barnesfield as a Category A prisoner. She was later transferred to HM Prison Low Newton before, in 2019, being transferred to HM Prison Newhall, where she continued to protest her evidence. And that concludes the casebook on Fred and Rosemary West. Probably one of the most evil and sadistic and prolific killer couples in this country, and maybe even the world. The horror that must have been endured, and the horror that went on in the notorious 25 Cromwell Street, I feel will never ever be forgotten, especially by the people of Gloucester. And as a side note, the house 25 Cromwell Street was demolished and the street renamed to distance from the grisly past. I hope you've enjoyed this initial serial killer file on the dark ground, and I hope you look forward to the next dark ground video. Until next time, sleep tight, and remember, what's under the bed is not the only thing that you should be scared of. Until next time.